So the Gospel of John tells us about this wedding at Cana. Cana was a Galilean town that is only mentioned once in the New Testament here in this passage. And the story itself is a bit of a puzzle because we read it, and on the face of it, we're left wondering, why is this important? Why was this important enough for John to write down? Because it happens in a town we don't know. It concerned the wedding of a couple of people that John doesn't even bother naming. And the big crisis that Jesus faces here at this wedding is that they run out of wine. Now, if they'd run out of booze at our wedding, the net result would have been fewer relatives passed out on benches outside the restaurant. But I don't think it would have been a crisis. To me, when I hear, this party runs out of wine, I think that's almost like the definition of, rich people's problems. Oh no, we're out of Cabernet, whatever shall we do? And yet it's important enough to Jesus' ministry that John said, I got to make sure I tell this story. And we know it was important to John because how does he start the story? The Gospel of John starts this chapter by saying, and on the third day. And that's that marker that we talked about a couple weeks ago. The third day marker. Whenever we see it, it is like the gospel writer, flicking us in the forehead with his finger saying, hey, this is important, pay attention, listen to what I'm telling you. John tells us on the third day there was this wedding. So, why? Why is it important? Why does this little problem at a wedding reception 2,000 years ago matter to us? Well, I think sometimes we maybe can learn about something by looking at it from a different angle, by looking at it in a different way. And that got me to thinking maybe the problem is we don't really have the right perspective. We lack context because it happened so long ago and it happened in such a different culture. So I thought maybe we'd try telling the story in a little different way. So on the third day after Jesus was baptized, he went to a wedding in the county. Jesus and Mary went there because they had been invited. The disciples came along because they were Jesus's plus 12. So they went to the synagogue and they watched as this couple got married, and then they all walked over to the VFW hall where the reception was being held. And then way too early in the evening, something bad happened. Because Mary went up to the bar, get herself a beer, and they turned her away and said, sorry, we're out of beer. When she got over the shock, Mary felt sorry for her host, so she went back to the table where Jesus was, and he said, hey, son, you'll never guess what happened, but they've run out of beer. And Jesus looked over at the bar. You could see that the bartenders were starting to get that sort of trapped animal look. The people were lining up. And then he looked back at his mom and he shrugged and he said, not my problem. Did you try the chicken? And Mary then just gives him one of those mom looks, you know the one. And she goes back to the bar And she points over to Jesus, and she tells the bartenders, that guy there, whatever he says to do it. And they just look at one another like, okay, whatever. And they start emptying out their tip jars because they figure the night's over. So Jesus waits a few minutes, and then he gets up and he goes over to the bar, and he looks around, he sees some water jugs lined up against the wall, and he says, bring those over here, hook them up to the taps, why don't you? The bartenders look at one another, and they think, well, we got nothing else to do. So they do what he asks. And then he says, now, fill up a schooner for one of the taps. Give it to the DJ. And they roll their eyes again. These Galileans are crazy. And they pull the tap, pull the handle, and out comes not water, but golden foaming beer. It's a miracle. So they take the schooner of beer over to the DJ tastes it, and immediately he goes to the bridegroom and says, you are a wild man. You've completely ignored tradition. People at these things always serve the good stuff first, and they save the skunky beer till later when no one can tell the difference. But you saved the best beer for last. You are the man. And the line starts forming at the bar, and the people start laughing and talking again. Even get out on the dance floor. I know that's how I got out on the dance floor. And then Mary just looks across the hall, and she sees Jesus, and she smiles at him. And he smiles back and gives her one of these. And that's the end of the story. So what do we learn? Well, we learn it's a really, really good idea to have Jesus at your next big party. And we also learn that maybe his first career choice instead of carpenter should have been wedding planner. But what else do we get out of that? Is there anything else important in the story? Well, we know from our imagining of it that had he not intervened, it probably would have gone down in history as the worst reception ever. It would have been talked about by people for generations. Do you ever hear about that reception where they ran out of beer? What kind of doofuses were that? But other than that, the wedding itself, we know, was not important because John didn't even tell us who it was. You know, he didn't tack on one of those endings where he said, and then the groom went on to become the doctor that saved Mary's life, you know, Facebook stuff. So the wedding itself was not important. Parties themselves were saved, but they probably weren't important. So what about that miracle itself then? Maybe that's what John wants us to notice. Was there something particularly outstanding about that miracle that Jesus worked, other than the fact, of course, you know, it was a suspension of the laws of chemistry and physics? Well, John counted it as the first sign of Jesus. The first wonder, the first miracle. So that's something, I guess. Of course, when you think about miracles and Jesus performing wonders, saving somebody's party seems kind of lame because everything else he does is, you know, healing somebody who's sick or feeding thousands of people, healing a leper, making a crippled man walk, raising someone from the dead. And oh yeah, he supplied with beer. It seems out of place. But yet, John tells us that's the main thing. When they ran out of wine, Jesus provided it. Is that significant then? And it turns out it is in a couple of different ways. It starts to take us toward the answer to why John told us this story. The first important thing to note is that the stone jars that Jesus used for this were jars that normally held water that was used for what's called the mikvah, the purification, the cleansing that was part of the culture back then. If you were ceremonially unclean for some reason, you went through this purifying bath. It came from the water in those jars. And we know that because they were stone jars. Because that's the only thing you could use for that kind of water. So by doing what he did, pouring the water in and getting the wine out, Jesus basically said, you know, you can forget the ritual purification now. The water is not what's important anymore. It's what comes out of it. At the wedding, it was the wine. But we know that by the end of Jesus' ministry, Jesus was teaching of a new covenant with God. And he was using wine as a stand-in for his blood. His blood that was going to be shed on the cross. So one meaning then is that the ritual purification was being replaced by the blood of Jesus Christ, with wine as the stand-in. That's one meaning that John wanted to get across. And the other is that symbolically, in first century Israel, wine was a sign of the harvest. You harvested grapes, you got wine. It was seen as a manifestation of God's abundance being bestowed upon God's people. It was a source of joy. So when you were at an event and the wine ran out, in a very public way, that symbolized that there was just not enough abundance from God anymore. There was not enough joy to bless those who were at that particular event. And when Jesus turns the water into wine and makes it flow for the people once more, that is Jesus blessing the people unexpectedly. And by turning all of that water into wine, Jesus provides them with more than just what they need, but there's an abundance of it. There's an overabundance, more than they could ever possibly even use at that party. David Lowes, the theologian and writer and pastor, points out that the volume of water that Jesus transformed into wine would have been on the order of 1,000 bottles of fresh, incomparably delicious wine. More than they could ever possibly drink at that reception. So that's why John told us this story. The wedding at Cana was an important moment symbolically. It was a foreshadowing of salvation when the blood of Jesus would save us. Again, symbolically, wine. And it was that moment when Jesus stepped out of the shadows and declared that the world was going to change. And in fact, he declared that the world had changed now that he was here and started his ministry. More than that, it was Jesus declaring that he wasn't just going to share enough of God's grace anymore, but he would be sharing and showing us an abundance of God's grace, a surplus, a superabundance, an embarrassment of riches. more than we could ever even imagine or need or use, was going to be poured out on us through him. And that's a bold statement from Jesus. It's a bold statement for us to remember even today. Because in Cana, Jesus was telling us that we have not just enough, but we have more than enough to satisfy ourselves, satisfy our needs, to change our lives and reorder our hearts. And we have him working to change us. And the wedding at Cana was also a reminder that Jesus comes to us at unexpected times, in unexpected ways. And that when he does that, he is more than sufficient to meet our needs. Jesus is more than sufficient to satisfy our hearts and our souls if we are willing to receive the abundance that he brings us. So when the burdens of this world seem about to drag us under, to ruin us and break our spirits, to expose us to the world as failures, then and there is where we can find Jesus, offering us hope through God's abundant grace, offering us peace for our souls, and showing us that God's love really is unending. Whether it's by turning water into wine, or despair into hope, or hatred into love and acceptance, whether it's turning brokenness into healing, Jesus brings change if we will just trust him enough and be brave enough to let him be that change within us.